love with her. She finds him barely conscious in the snow, brings him into her home, and shows him a kindness he hasn't felt in years. But as he heals, so does something inside him, something he thought he'd lost forever. He hides who he really is, terrified that the truth will push her away. And just when she starts to open her heart, she discovers everything: his name, his fortune, and the lie that could ruin it all. Can love survive when it's built on a secret? Or will the truth tear them apart before it even begins? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Lila Hart glanced out the frosted window of Petal and Pine, watching fat snowflakes tumble from the darkening sky. The weather forecast had warned about this storm, but seeing the heavy clouds roll over the mountains still made her stomach twist with worry. Best to close early and get home, which, thankfully, was just upstairs. She moved through her beloved flower shop, adjusting thermostats and checking on her precious blooms. The sweet perfume of roses mingled with the earthy scent of pine boughs she'd arranged for the holiday season. Her mother had always said flowers needed extra care during storms, treating them like the living, breathing things they were. "Just a little longer, my pretties," she whispered, misting the delicate petals one last time. "We'll weather this together." The wind rattled the shop's front windows as she gathered her things. She paused, eyeing the small arrangement of winter roses she'd prepared earlier. Mrs. Evers would love them. The elderly woman had been under the weather lately, and Lila couldn't bear the thought of her spending the storm alone without something cheerful to look at. Bundling up in her thick wool coat, Lila cradled the flowers and stepped out into the swirling snow. The bitter cold bit at her cheeks as she carefully made her way next door to Mrs. Evers's little blue house. The porch light was already on, as if expecting her. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Evers exclaimed when she opened the door, her weathered face crinkling with delight. "You shouldn't have ventured out in this weather." "These beauties insisted on visiting you," Lila said, presenting the arrangement. The rose's deep red petals seemed to glow against the white backdrop of snow. Mrs. Evers touched the flowers gently. "Just like your mother, always thinking of others first." Her eyes softened with memory. She'd be proud of you keeping her shop alive with so much love. Lila's throat tightened. "Do you have everything you need for the storm? I can run to the store." "Now don't you worry about me," Mrs. Evers interrupted, patting Lila's hand. "I've got soup simmering and enough firewood to last a week. You get yourself home safe." Back in her apartment above the shop, Lila shed her wet clothes and changed into warm flannel pajamas. The old building creaked against the strengthening wind, but the sound was oddly comforting, familiar, like an old friend's voice. She stirred her own pot of homemade vegetable soup, inhaling the aromatic steam. The fireplace in the corner of her living room needed attention. Lila knelt before it, carefully arranging logs and kindling the way her father had taught her years ago. Soon, cheerful flames danced behind the grate, casting warm shadows across the room's exposed brick walls. Just as she was about to settle in with her soup and a book, something caught her eye through the window. Headlights, weak and wavering, flickered briefly near the tree line past her small parking area. They disappeared so quickly she almost thought she'd imagined them. Then came a sound, faint but distinct, a dull thud carried on the wind. Lila pressed her face to the cold window, squinting through the curtain of snow. The rational part of her mind said to stay inside where it was safe and warm. But what if someone needed help? Mom would go look, she murmured to herself, already reaching for her coat and boots again. She grabbed her heavy-duty flashlight from under the sink, the one her father insisted she keep for emergencies. The snow had deepened considerably in the short time she'd been inside. It crunched under her boots as she made her way across the parking area, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The wind whipped snow into her face, and she pulled her scarf higher. Near the tree line, her light caught something dark against the white ground. Her heart jumped into her throat when she realized it was a person, a man, face down in the snow. A thin trail of blood had already frozen in his dark hair. "Oh God," she breathed, dropping to her knees beside him. Her fingers, clumsy with cold and fear, found his neck. There, a pulse, weak but steady. His skin was already dangerously cold. "Sir, can you hear me?" She gently turned his face away from the snow. No response, but she could see shallow breaths forming small clouds in the freezing air. Lila's truck sat only 30 feet away, but in this weather, it might as well have been a mile. Still, she had to try. Hooking her arms under his shoulders, she began the arduous process of dragging him through the deepening snow. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she kept going, one step at a time. Getting him into the truck bed was even harder. She nearly cried with relief when she finally managed it, though her back felt like it might never forgive her. The truck's engine turned over reluctantly in the cold, but it started. She only needed to move it a few feet closer to the shop side entrance, but even that short distance was treacherous in the rapidly accumulating snow. By the time she got him inside, Lila was shaking from exhaustion and cold. She managed to lay him on the thick rug before the fireplace, her arms trembling as she lowered him down. In the warm light, she could finally get a good look at him. The gash on his head wasn't as bad as she'd feared, but he was dangerously cold. She worked quickly, removing his wet clothes down to his underwear and wrapping him in every blanket she owned. The first aid kit under her bathroom sink provided supplies to clean and bandage his head wound. As she worked, she could feel warmth slowly returning to his skin. Suddenly, his lips moved. Lila leaned closer, heart pounding. "Sarah." He mumbled, the word barely audible. His eyes flickered but didn't open, and then he was still again, breathing steadily but remaining unconscious. Lila settled into her armchair, knowing sleep wasn't an option. Someone had to watch him, make sure he kept breathing, ensure his temperature stabilized. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling windows and howling through the eaves like a wild thing. She pulled her knees to her chest, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest beneath the blankets. The fire crackled softly, and she found herself wondering what series of events had led this stranger to her doorstep on such a bitter night. "Just hold on," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. "We'll weather this together." The next day, morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, casting a pale glow across Lila's living room. The storm had settled into an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of snow-laden branches. Her apartment felt different in the weak daylight, both familiar and strange, like waking up in someone else's dream. The power had gone out sometime during the night, and her cell phone showed no signal. Lila moved quietly through her apartment, careful not to disturb her unconscious guest. The gas stove clicked and whooshed to life, and she filled her kettle with water. While it heated, she gathered clean washcloths and a bowl. Back in the living room, she knelt beside the man, gently dabbing his forehead with a damp cloth. The gash had stopped bleeding, but angry bruising spread across his temple. As she worked, his eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. Confusion clouded his face as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "You're safe," Lila said softly, drawing back to give him space. "I found you in the snow last night. You were hurt." He blinked several times, wincing as he tried to sit up. Lila quickly steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. "Easy there. You took quite a hit to the head." "Where?" His voice was rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where am I?" "Pine Brook. My apartment above my flower shop. She offered him a glass of water, which he accepted with slightly trembling hands. I'm Lila Hart. He took a careful sip before answering. Evan. Just Evan. He pressed his fingers to his temple, face tight with pain. I was driving north, I think. Everything after that is... He shook his head slightly, then immediately regretted the movement. The storm was brutal last night. You're lucky I saw your headlights. Lila stood, retrieving some aspirin from her first aid kit. Here, this should help with the pain. As the morning wore on, Evan grew steadier. Lila insisted he rest on her couch while she checked the conditions outside. The town was blanketed in pristine white, snow piled so high it reached halfway up her shop's front windows. The few people brave enough to venture out reported the roads were completely impassable. You'll have to stay until they clear the roads, she told him when she returned upstairs, which could be a couple of days given how deep it is. Evan nodded, looking somewhat lost in the borrowed sweater she'd found in her father's old things. I appreciate your kindness. I don't want to impose... It's not an imposition, Lila interrupted gently. I couldn't exactly leave you out there to freeze. Throughout the day, they existed in a strange but comfortable rhythm. Evan moved carefully at first, but soon proved surprisingly handy. While Lila sorted through paperwork at her kitchen table, she noticed him examining her sticky kitchen drawer. Been meaning to fix that for months, she said, but he was already reaching for her toolbox, stored under the sink where her mother had always kept it. Simple repair, he said, working with quiet efficiency. Just needed the runner realigned. When he finished, the drawer slid smoothly on its track. Later, he replaced a flickering bulb in her reading lamp, somehow knowing exactly how to rewire the ancient fixture. Lila watched him work, struck by the careful precision of his movements. You're good at fixing things, she observed. A shadow crossed his face. Used to be. These days, I'm not so sure. In the afternoon, Evan wandered downstairs to her shop while she watered the plants. The space was magical in the snow-filtered light, flowers creating splashes of color against white frosted windows. This place is incredible, he said, touching a delicate orchid petal with gentle fingers. The layout, the atmosphere, it's perfect. Lila felt her cheeks warm. It was my mother's. She built it from nothing. She adjusted a vase of lilies, remembering her mother's hands performing the same gesture countless times. She passed last year. The shop is all I have left of her now. I'm sorry, Evan said softly, and something in his voice told her he truly understood loss. Sometimes I dream about expanding, she found herself saying. The empty storefront next door. Mom always talked about turning it into a garden cafe. Somewhere people could sit among the flowers, drink coffee, feel at peace. She laughed quietly. Silly dream, really. Why silly? Small towns, small dreams, I suppose. She shrugged. Besides, it would take more money than I'll ever have. As evening approached and the power remained out, they shared soup warmed on the gas stove, eating by candlelight at her small kitchen table. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate atmosphere that should have felt awkward with a stranger, but somehow didn't. After dinner, Lila showed Evan her flower pressing station, heavy books laid out on an old wooden table, pages carefully lined with parchment paper. My mother taught me this, she explained, demonstrating with a perfect rose. Each flower needs different pressure, different drying times. You have to know their language. Their language? Evan leaned closer, genuinely interested. The Victorians believed every flower had a meaning. Red roses for love, of course, but also things like purple hyacinth for sorrow, or daffodils for new beginnings. She smiled, remembering her mother's voice explaining the same thing. Mom said flowers speak in whispers. You just have to learn to listen. Evan picked up a pressed forget-me-not, holding it carefully to the candlelight. And what does this one say? True love, memories. Lila watched his face as he studied the delicate blue petals. Mom always said they were for the quiet kind of love, the kind that lasts. Something shifted in Evan's expression, a softening around his eyes. He set the flower down with exquisite care, as if it were made of glass. Outside, snow continued to fall silently, but in the candlelit warmth of Lila's apartment, neither of them seemed to notice or mind. The next morning brought a gentle stillness as the storm began to ease. Sunlight pierced through breaks in the clouds, making the blanket of snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Though the weather had calmed, the roads remained impassable. No plows had made it to their section of town yet, leaving Lila and Evan in their peaceful isolation above the flower shop. After a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, Evan insisted on helping around the shop. "It's the least I can do," he said, already rolling up his sleeves. "You saved my life." Lila led him downstairs, where the morning light streamed through the frost-painted windows, creating rainbow prisms on the shop floor. She began her daily routine of checking on the flowers, adjusting temperatures, and misting the more delicate blooms. Evan followed, watching intently as she explained each step. As Lila moved to the counter to sort through some paperwork, Evan's attention was drawn to her old cash register. The ancient machine sat like a relic from another era, its keys worn smooth from years of use. "How long have you had this system?" he asked, examining the register with careful hands. "Forever," Lila laughed. "Mom bought it used when she first opened the shop. It's temperamental, but we know its quirks." Evan pressed a few keys, listening to the mechanical clicking. "Would you mind if I took a look? I might be able to help streamline things a bit." Lila hesitated only briefly before nodding. There was something trustworthy about his quiet competence. She retrieved her old laptop from the back office, and Evan set to work immediately, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced ease. Throughout the morning, Evan created a simple but effective digital inventory system. Lila watched in amazement as he transformed her cluttered spreadsheets into an organized database. He explained each step as he worked, his voice growing more animated when discussing the technical details. "See here?" He pointed to a column of numbers. "This will automatically track your stock levels and alert you when supplies run low. No more manual counting." By early afternoon, Lila's workspace had been completely transformed. Gone were the stacks of handwritten orders and confusing inventory lists. Everything was now organized, searchable, and synchronized. "This is incredible," she said, scrolling through the new system. "I can't believe how much easier this makes everything." They took a break for tea, settling into the cozy chairs by the shop's front window. Snow still blocked most of the view, but thin streams of sunlight filtered through, warming their faces. "Have you ever considered selling your arrangements online?" Evan asked, cradling his mug of Earl Grey. Lila stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I've wanted to for years. Mom and I used to talk about it, but..." She shrugged. "The whole tech side seemed overwhelming. I wouldn't know where to start." "I could help," Evan offered. "Build you a basic website. It's not as complicated as you might think." Before Lila could respond, he had already opened the laptop again. He pulled up a simple text editor and began typing lines of code. "See this?" He gestured for her to come closer. "This is HTML, the building blocks of every website. Think of it like a recipe. Each ingredient has its place, and when combined correctly, they create something beautiful." Lila leaned in, watching as he demonstrated how to create basic elements. To her surprise, the logic behind it started to make sense. It was like arranging flowers. Each element needed to be in the right place to create harmony. "Here, you try," he said, sliding the laptop toward her. With his guidance, Lila wrote her first lines of code. When a simple heading appeared on the screen, she felt a spark of excitement she hadn't experienced since learning flower arrangement from her mother. As evening approached, Lila headed upstairs to prepare dinner, a hearty beef stew that filled the apartment with warm, comforting aromas. Evan remained in the shop, moving slowly between the displays. His reflection ghosted across the darkened windows as he studied each arrangement with careful attention. Lila found him standing before a particular bouquet, white lilies mixed with purple hyacinth and soft pink roses. The small card attached read simply, "Healing." "This one," he said quietly as she approached. "Who was it for?" "A woman who lost her sister," Lila explained. "She comes in every week, usually just to talk. The flowers help her process her grief." Evan touched one of the lily petals with gentle fingers. "You don't just sell flowers," he said softly. "You heal people." The words hung in the quiet shop, weighted with understanding. When Evan turned to face her, something had changed in his expression. For the first time since she'd found him in the snow, he smiled. Not the polite, careful smile he'd worn before, but something real and unguarded. It transformed his entire face, softening the worried lines around his eyes, making him look younger and more at peace. It was the smile of someone who had forgotten how to feel safe, suddenly remembering. The next morning brought more than just sunlight. A soft hum filled the apartment as power returned to Pinebrook, accompanied by the familiar chirping of Lila's phone as delayed messages flooded in. She sat at her kitchen counter, watching the screen light up repeatedly with concerned texts from neighbors and regular customers. Evan stood by the window, his shoulders tense as he watched the town slowly come back to life. The sound of distant snowplows echoed through the streets, and the first few brave souls ventured out to begin shoveling their driveways. "Everyone's worried," Lila said, scrolling through her messages. She quickly typed out responses, reassuring people she was safe. When she reached Mrs. Evers's multiple concerned texts, she paused to write a longer reply. "Your neighbor?" Evan asked, his voice tight. "Yes, Mrs. Evers. She probably tried to check on me when the power went out." Lila glanced up at him. "She's like family." Evan nodded but remained by the window, his fingers drumming against the sill. The return of connectivity seemed to have brought back his guardedness, replacing the ease of the past few days with visible anxiety. "You know," Lila said carefully, setting down her phone, "there's no rush to make any calls if you're not ready." He turned to face her, surprise flickering across his features. "That obvious, huh?" "A little." She offered a gentle smile. "Want to get some fresh air instead? The snow's stopped and it might help clear your head." Relief softened his expression. "I'd like that, though I should probably make some calls soon." He ran a hand through his hair. "I just dread what comes next." Lila didn't press for details. Instead, she pulled on her winter boots and thick coat, grabbing an extra scarf for Evan. They made their way downstairs and out into the crisp morning air. The world had transformed overnight. Everything was draped in pristine white, the snow untouched except for the main road where the plows had begun their work. Their boots crunched through the fresh powder as they walked, leaving twin trails behind them. "I found you this way," Lila said, pointing toward the tree line beyond her parking area. "Right around here." They followed the path she'd taken that night, the journey much easier in daylight. Near the trees, they spotted it, Evan's car, half buried in snow, its dark shape barely visible under the white blanket. "I remember driving," Evan said quietly, approaching the vehicle. The storm got worse so quickly. Then, nothing. Together, they cleared enough snow to open the driver's side door. The interior was cold and damp, with some snow having blown in through the partially open window. Evan reached for the glove compartment, but his movement slowed when he found his phone. Its screen completely shattered. "My wallet's gone," he said, checking the center console and his coat pockets. "Must have fallen out somewhere between here and..." He gestured vaguely toward where Lila had found him. "That explains the no ID," Lila said. She studied the car's position. "We might be able to tow it back with my truck. It's not too deeply stuck." It took them nearly an hour to attach the tow rope and carefully maneuver the vehicle back toward the shop. Lila drove her truck while Evan steered his car, the process slow but steady. By the time they parked both vehicles safely behind the shop, their cheeks were red from the cold and exertion. The rest of the day passed quietly. Lila worked in the shop, filling delayed orders and arranging deliveries for when the roads cleared completely. Evan helped where he could, but his mind seemed elsewhere, his thoughts obviously heavy with whatever decision he was avoiding. As evening settled in, they shared another simple meal, this time baked chicken with roasted vegetables. The fireplace cast warm shadows across the room, and neither felt the need to turn on the overhead lights. Evan sat on the couch afterwards, staring into the flames. His untouched phone lay on the coffee table, a silent reminder of the outside world waiting to rush back in. "Do you think," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "that people can really start over? Truly begin again?" Lila, who had been clearing the dishes, set down the plates and joined him on the couch. "I do," she said, "but only if they stop running first." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Evan turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face as if hoping to find certainty there. The flames cast shifting patterns of light across his features, highlighting the vulnerability in his expression. "Maybe I finally stopped," he said softly, and it sounded like both a revelation and a promise. He didn't reach for his phone that night. Instead, he picked up the book of pressed flowers they'd worked on days before, turning the pages with careful fingers. The tension gradually left his shoulders as he examined each preserved bloom, and his breathing slowed to match the quiet rhythm of the evening. Lila worked on some paperwork nearby, stealing occasional glances at him. She watched as his head began to nod, the book slowly settling onto his chest as sleep overtook him. When his breathing deepened into the steady pattern of true rest, she set aside her work. Moving quietly, she retrieved a handmade quilt from the chest near the window, one her mother had crafted years ago. With gentle movements, she draped it over his sleeping form, careful not to disturb him. The book of pressed flowers rose and fell with his steady breathing, its pages holding memories of the peace they'd found in these strange, suspended days. The morning sun painted golden stripes across Lila's bedroom floor when she first stirred. An unfamiliar aroma drifted up the stairs, rich, dark coffee, the good kind she kept for special occasions. She blinked, adjusting to the brightness streaming through her window. The storm's fury had given way to a crystalline winter morning, the world outside transformed into a sparkling wonderland. Pulling on her warmest sweater, Lila made her way downstairs. She found Evan in the kitchen, already dressed in his now dried clothes from the accident. His borrowed sweater lay neatly folded on the counter beside a fresh pot of coffee. A small backpack, one she'd lent him to hold the few items they'd recovered from his car, sat packed and ready by the door. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, offering a gentle smile that didn't quite mask the determination in his eyes. Through the window behind him, she could see the newly plowed main street, a dark ribbon cutting through the pristine snow. I made coffee, he said, gesturing to the steaming pot. Least I could do. Lila accepted the mug he offered, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. Evan nodded, his hands finding his pockets. Time I stop hiding, he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The roads are clear now, and He glanced at the window, then back to her. I need to face what's waiting. The kitchen felt different in the morning light, smaller somehow, as if the magic of their snowbound days was already fading. Lila sipped her coffee, letting its warmth spread through her chest. Do you need a ride into town? You wouldn't mind. Of course not. She set down her mug. Let me just grab my coat. The drive into town was quiet at first, both of them taking in the transformed landscape. The pines along the road stood like sentries, their branches heavy with snow and sparkling with ice. They passed the darkened windows of Petal and Pine, and Evan's gaze lingered on the shop's hand-painted sign. Next door stood the empty lot, just a small patch of land with an old foundation, barely visible under the snow. Lila had looked at it so many times she usually didn't notice it anymore, but today, with Evan beside her, she saw it through new eyes. Tell me more about the cafe, Evan said suddenly, breaking the silence. Your mother's dream. You said she used to plan it all out. Lila's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She did. Every detail. A smile tugged at her lips despite the ache in her chest. She had this old sketchbook full of layouts, where the tables would go, what the counter would look like. She wanted big windows everywhere so people could watch the snow fall while they had their coffee. Like today, Evan observed softly. Yeah. Lila blinked rapidly, focusing on the road. She even created recipes, these amazing desserts inspired by different flowers, lavender cream puffs, rose petal tarts. She said every treat should tell a story, just like every flower has a meaning. The truck's heater hummed steadily as they turned onto Main Street. What stopped her? Evan asked. Money, mostly. Running the flower shop took everything we had. Lila drew a shaky breath. Then she got sick and, well, dreams had to wait. They pulled into the small bus station lot, the gravel crunching under the truck's tires. A few other cars were parked there, their windows frosted over. The morning bus idled nearby, its exhaust creating clouds in the cold air. Lila put the truck in park but left it running. Neither of them moved to get out right away. You could still do it, Evan said. The cafe, your mother's dream. Maybe someday. Lila managed a small smile, though her eyes burned with unshed tears. Right now, keeping the shop alive is enough. They sat in silence for a moment longer, watching passengers board the bus with their bags and tickets. Finally, Evan reached for his backpack. Thank you, he said, turning to face her fully. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. For more than just saving my life. The words seemed inadequate for whatever passed between them in that moment. He didn't move to hug her, didn't try to compress their strange, beautiful days into a simple gesture. He just looked at her like she had given him something precious, something he hadn't even known he was missing until he found it in her quiet shop, among her flowers and pressed petals. Then he was gone, climbing the bus steps without looking back. Lila watched through the window as he found a seat, his figure becoming less distinct behind the glass. The bus's doors closed with a hydraulic hiss. She sat there as the bus pulled away, taking with it a man whose last name she didn't know, whose number she couldn't call, who had left no promise of return. The morning sun caught the snow in brilliant sparkles, almost too bright to look at as the bus disappeared around the corner. Something hollow opened up in Lila's chest, an emptiness she hadn't expected to feel. In just a few days, this stranger had somehow become something essential, like a favorite book or a well-worn sweater. Now he was gone, and she was left with the strange sensation of missing something she hadn't known she needed until it was no longer there. A week crawled by like honey in winter, each day blending into the next as Lila fell back into her familiar routines. The shop seemed quieter now, though nothing had really changed. She arranged flowers, chatted with customers, and tried not to think about the mysterious man who had shared her home during the storm. That Tuesday afternoon, she pulled into her usual parking spot behind the shop, grocery bags rustling in the passenger seat. The sun hung low in the winter sky, casting long shadows across the snow-packed ground. As she gathered her things, something caught her eye. A white rectangle stark against the dark wood of her shop's front door. Lila approached slowly, shifting her grocery bags to one arm. An envelope had been carefully taped to the door, perfectly centered. No name was written on it, just her address in neat, understated handwriting. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for formal documents. She peeled it off carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket, fumbling with her keys to get inside. The shop's warmth enveloped her as she set her groceries on the counter, her fingers already working to open the envelope. Inside, she found several pages of legal documents, crisp and official-looking. Her eyes skimmed the first paragraph, then stopped. She read it again, slower this time, her heart beginning to race. It was a property transfer offer for the empty lot next door. The very lot her mother had dreamed of turning into a cafe. Lila sank onto her stool behind the counter, her legs suddenly weak. The asking price listed made her blink in disbelief. It was well below market value, impossibly so for prime Main Street property. She knew what downtown lots were worth. She'd researched them extensively after her mother passed, trying to find a way to make the cafe dream work. Her hands trembled as she read through the rest of the document. Everything seemed legitimate. There were official letterheads, proper legal terminology, even a broker's contact information. But something about it felt surreal, like a dream that had wandered into daylight. Lila reached for her phone, dialing the property office number listed on the letterhead. Each ring seemed to last an eternity. Mountain Valley Property Office, this is Sandra speaking. Hi, yes. Lila's voice came out shakier than she intended. I'm calling about a property transfer offer I received today for lot 247 on Main Street. Ah, yes. Sandra's voice brightened with recognition. Ms. Hart, we've been expecting your call. I can confirm that everything in that offer is completely legitimate. Lila gripped the edge of her counter. But who's selling it? The current owner wishes to remain anonymous. The property is held through a private holding company. Sandra paused, shuffling papers. But I can assure you all the documentation is in order. The offer is valid for 30 days. I don't understand, Lila said. The price? Yes, it's quite generous, Sandra agreed. The owner was very specific about the terms. Oh, and there is one particular clause I should draw your attention to, regarding the future use of the property. Lila flipped through the papers until she found it. There, in clear legal language, was a stipulation that any building constructed on the lot must adhere to the original cafe designs as detailed in Eleanor Hart's personal sketches. Her mother's name on the official document made Lila's throat tight. How did they know about those? I'm afraid I don't have that information, Sandra replied. But everything is completely above board, I assure you. Would you like me to walk you through the rest of the contract? Lila listened numbly as Sandra explained the details, but her mind was spinning. Only one person had heard about her mother's cafe sketches in recent memory, Only one person had sat at her kitchen table while she described those dreams in detail. After ending the call, Lila locked up the shop early. She grabbed her mother's old journal from upstairs, the one containing all the cafe sketches, and walked out to the empty lot next door. The setting sun painted the snow in shades of pink and gold. Lila brushed snow off a low wall that remained from the lot's previous building and sat down. Her breath formed clouds in the cold air as she opened the worn journal. Her mother's familiar handwriting filled the pages, accompanied by detailed drawings. Here was the counter layout she'd described, with its curved edge perfect for displaying pastries. There were the big windows she'd wanted, designed to flood the space with natural light. Notes in the margins detailed recipe ideas and flower arrangements that would complement each season. Lila ran her fingers over the sketches, remembering how her mother's eyes would light up when she talked about this dream. It had seemed impossible then, a beautiful fantasy they could only visit in these pages. Now, she looked up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. The empty lot stretched before her like a blank canvas, full of possibility. She could almost see it, the cafe her mother had imagined, warm lights glowing through those big windows, the scent of coffee and fresh-baked treats mixing with the fragrance of flowers from her shop next door. "What are you doing, Evan?" she whispered to the stars. The question floated away on her frozen breath unanswered. But she knew. Deep down, she knew exactly what he was doing. This quiet man who had stumbled into her life during a snowstorm had seen something in her mother's dream, something worth preserving, worth fighting for. Lila sat there until the cold began to seep through her coat, her mother's journal clutched to her chest. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and clear in the winter sky, and she felt a certainty settle over her like a warm blanket. The next morning, she arrived at the property office just as they opened. Sandra looked up with a knowing smile as Lila approached her desk, the contract and a pen already in hand. Without hesitation, Lila signed her name on every marked line, her mother's journal tucked safely in her bag. Each signature felt like a promise, to her mother, to herself, and to a man who had disappeared back into the world but had left behind something extraordinary, the chance to make an impossible dream come true. 2 days after signing the deed, Lila was arranging a display of early spring tulips when a convoy of trucks pulled up outside her shop. She watched through the window as men in work clothes climbed out, carrying clipboards and surveying equipment. Her heart skipped when she saw them heading toward her door. A tall man with salt and pepper hair and weathered hands entered first, removing his hard hat as he approached the counter. "Ms. Hart, I'm Jim Cooper, the project foreman." He extended his hand with a warm smile. "We're here about the cafe renovation." Lila shook his hand, trying to hide her surprise. "Already? I just signed the paperwork 2 days ago." Jim chuckled. "Yes, ma'am. Everything's been fast-tracked. All the permits and plans were pre-approved with the city." He pulled a thick roll of blueprints from under his arm. "Speaking of plans, I wanted to review these with you." He spread the papers across her counter, carefully moving aside a bucket of daisies. Lila's breath caught as she looked at the drawings. There, rendered in precise architectural detail, was the exact sketch she'd made on a paper napkin during that snowy evening with Evan. She remembered how he'd listened intently as she'd drawn, asking questions about every detail. "This can't be," she whispered, running her fingers over the familiar layout. "Is something wrong?" Jim asked, concerned. Lila shook her head quickly. No. It's perfect. It's exactly right." The builders wasted no time. Within hours, the empty lot transformed into a bustling construction site. The speed and precision of their work left Lila dizzy. Each morning brought new progress, each detail emerging exactly as she'd imagined during those long conversations by firelight. The greenhouse-style windows she'd described were being installed along the eastern wall, designed to catch the morning sun. Antique-style light fixtures, the kind she'd pointed out in her mother's old magazine clippings, arrived carefully packed in wooden crates. The wooden pergola she'd mentioned wanting, somewhere to drink tea under falling petals, she'd said dreamily to Evan, was taking shape along the side garden. Mrs. Evers stopped by one afternoon, watching the workers with keen interest. "My word, Lila. When you said you had plans for the lot, I never imagined anything like this." She patted Lila's arm. "Your mother would be over the moon." Other locals began dropping by too, offering help and sharing in her excitement. Old Mr. Peterson, who owned the hardware store, brought over some vintage door handles he'd been saving. "These belong to the original general store," he said proudly. "Thought they might suit your place." Sarah from the bookshop next door volunteered to help paint once the walls were up. "We could make it a community thing," she suggested, "like an old-fashioned barn raising." Lila accepted their help and enthusiasm with genuine gratitude, but she felt almost guilty pretending this was all part of some careful plan she'd made. Every perfect detail, every swift solution to potential problems, every precise match to her mother's dreams. She knew who was behind it all. The thought of Evan orchestrating all this from somewhere unknown made her chest tight. How many hours had he spent memorizing her casual mentions of what she wanted? How carefully had he listened to her descriptions of her mother's sketches? The level of attention he'd paid to every small detail was overwhelming. As sunset approached that evening, most of the workers had gone home. Lila walked through the half-finished space alone, running her hands along the newly installed support beams. The cafe was taking shape so quickly it seemed almost magical. Tomorrow they would start on the flooring. Reclaimed wood, exactly the shade she'd once described while pressing flowers with Evan. The last rays of sun streamed through the greenhouse windows, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Lila made her way to where the counter would be, the curved one from her mother's sketches, perfect for displaying pastries. A small package sat there, looking strangely out of place among the construction materials. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. It was wrapped simply in brown paper, no bigger than her palm. The wrapping fell away easily, revealing a small glass case, expertly crafted with beveled edges that caught the fading light. Inside, preserved perfectly, was a pressed snowdrop flower. Lila's breath caught sharply in her throat. She knew this flower. She had placed it herself on Evan's pillow that first night, when he was still unconscious from his fall in the snow. It had seemed right somehow, this delicate bloom that pushed through winter's hardest days to find the light. She held the glass case tightly, its edges pressing into her palms. There was no note, no signature, nothing to explain its presence. Just the flower, preserved forever in crystal clarity, as perfect as the day she'd picked it. The meaning wasn't lost on her. In the language of flowers she'd taught Evan during those snowbound days, snowdrops represented hope and new beginnings. They were among the first flowers to bloom after winter, pushing through frozen ground to announce spring's arrival. Tears blurred her vision as she stood in the growing darkness, holding this small, precious token. Through the greenhouse window, she could see the first stars appearing in the twilight sky. The same stars she'd whispered to that night on the empty lot, wondering what Evan was doing. Now she knew. He'd been busy making her dreams and her mother's dreams real, with a thoroughness and care that took her breath away. And he'd left her this single flower as his only signature, this quiet acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them during that snowbound week. Lila pressed the glass case to her heart, feeling its cool surface against her palm. Around her, the half-finished cafe stood silent, full of promise and possibility, while outside, the last light faded from the sky. 3 weeks after finding the snowdrop, Lila sat at her shop's counter, sorting through the day's mail. Bills, catalogs, and a few wedding consultation requests made their usual pile. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in its golden beams as she methodically opened each envelope. Her fingers paused on a thick, official-looking envelope from the state tax office. The crisp white paper felt heavy in her hands, but something wasn't right. The address was her shop's, but the name... Lila's heart stopped. Evan Carlisle. She read it again, certain her eyes were playing tricks on her, but there it was, printed in stark black letters. Evan Carlisle, C.O. Petal and Pine Florist. Her hands began to shake. The name tugged at something in her memory, something she should know. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone and typed the name into Google. The results loaded, and Lila felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Dozens of headlines filled her screen, all featuring the same face she'd tended to by firelight just weeks ago. Tech billionaire Evan Carlisle exposes massive data privacy scandal. Carlisle Industries CEO disappears after whistleblowing. Where is Evan Carlisle? Tech genius goes dark. After corporate fallout. Photos showed him in business suits, giving keynote speeches, standing in front of gleaming corporate buildings. His hair was shorter, his face clean-shaven. But those eyes, those same haunted, gentle eyes that had watched her press flowers and listened to her dreams, were unmistakable. "Oh God," Lila whispered, her phone clattering onto the counter. The man she'd pulled from the snow, the quiet stranger who'd fixed her drawer and coded her website, was one of the most famous tech entrepreneurs in the country. He'd built a multi-billion-dollar empire, then sacrificed everything to expose his own company's unethical practices. And then he'd vanished, until he'd ended up half dead in the snow behind her shop. Memories rushed back with painful clarity. His reluctance to use phones, his expertise with her computer systems, the way he'd flinched at news reports, his question about starting over. All of it made horrible sense now. A wave of betrayal washed over her, hot and sudden. He'd sat there night after night, listening to her pour out her heart about her mother, about her struggles with the shop, about her dreams of the cafe. He'd eaten her soup, slept under her quilt, accepted her care and trust, all while hiding who he really was. The cafe wasn't some anonymous act of kindness. It was pocket change to a billionaire, a gesture that probably meant nothing to someone who could buy and sell half the town. Every intimate conversation, every shared moment by the fire, felt suddenly tainted. Anger rose in her throat like bile. She'd been so worried about him, so careful with his privacy, so gentle with what she thought were his wounds. And he'd lied to her face the entire time. Lila stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. She grabbed her keys and the tax envelope, marching out of the shop and across to the construction site. The morning crew looked up in surprise as she strode past them. "Everyone out," she called, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Work is stopped until further notice." The workers exchanged confused glances but began gathering their tools. Lila waited until the last person left, then locked the door with a decisive click. The half-finished cafe stood silent around her. Afternoon light streamed through those perfect greenhouse windows, the ones he'd remembered from her casual mention. The antique lights hung like accusations from the ceiling. Every beam, every nail, every carefully chosen detail felt like a mockery now. She walked to the counter. the curved one from her mother's sketches, and slapped down the tax envelope. It landed next to the glass-encased snowdrop, which caught the light mockingly. The delicate white flower that had meant so much to her now seemed to taunt her with its preserved perfection. Lila couldn't even look at it anymore. This whole place, this dream come true, suddenly felt like a lie. She turned her back on the construction site and climbed the stairs to her apartment above the shop. The space that had felt so cozy during the snowstorm now seemed to echo with remembered conversations. She could still see him sitting at her kitchen table, carefully showing her how to code. Still picture him sleeping on her couch, that book of pressed flowers rising and falling with his breath. That couch, that quilt. Lila crossed the room in quick strides and yanked the handmade quilt off the couch. Her hands shook as she folded it, each crisp movement sharp with hurt and anger. The fabric that had kept him warm, that had witnessed their quiet conversations and shared silences, now felt like it burned her fingers. She carried the folded quilt to her storage closet and shoved it onto the highest shelf, pushing it far back into the shadows. As she closed the closet door, her anger finally cracked, revealing the deep hurt beneath. "You should have trusted me," she whispered to the quiet room, her voice breaking on the last word. The apartment seemed to absorb her words into its silence, offering no comfort, no answers. Only the ghost of his presence remained, haunting every corner where they'd shared those snowbound days. Days that now felt like nothing but an elaborate deception. 2 days after halting construction, Lila pulled her truck into Mrs. Evers's driveway, the back loaded with grocery bags. The morning air was crisp, carrying the last hints of winter even as early spring buds began appearing on the trees. She gathered the bags in her arms, careful not to crush the fresh bread tucked between cans of soup and boxes of tea. Mrs. Evers opened the door before Lila could knock, her weathered face creasing into a warm smile. "There's my favorite delivery girl," she said, ushering Lila inside. The house smelled of cinnamon and coffee, as it always did. "I got everything on your list," Lila said, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. She began unpacking items while Mrs. Evers watched from her usual perch at the small breakfast table, hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "Thank you, dear. Now tell me, how's that lovely cafe coming along? I heard the construction stopped." Mrs. Evers' voice was gentle but direct, her eyes sharp despite her age. Lila's hand stilled on a can of peaches. She forced her lips into what she hoped was a convincing smile, though it felt stiff on her face. "It's complicated," she managed, arranging the cans in Mrs. Evers' pantry with careful precision. "Complicated," Mrs. Evers echoed, but didn't press further when Lila just nodded and continued unpacking groceries in silence. The drive back to her shop felt longer than usual, Lila's thoughts churning like storm clouds. As she pulled into her parking spot, something caught her eye. A small piece of paper taped to her shop window, fluttering in the breeze. Curious despite her mood, Lila approached the window. The note was written in careful child's handwriting, complete with backward letters and decorated with small flower doodles. "When does the cafe open? Maggie, age 7. Lila's throat tightened as she carefully peeled the note from the glass. She remembered Maggie, a regular visitor to the shop with her mother, always asking to smell every flower and leaving with a single daisy. The questions didn't stop there. Throughout the week, it seemed like everyone in town had something to say about Clara's garden. Mrs. Peterson, picking up her weekly arrangement, mentioned how excited she was to have a place to host her book club. Tom, the mailman, talked about looking forward to having somewhere to warm up during his route. "My grandmother's old china set needs a good home," Sarah from the hardware store said one morning, appearing at the shop with a carefully wrapped box. "Mom always said it was meant for serving tea." Before Lila could protest, more items began appearing. The Henderson brothers dropped off a beautifully restored bookshelf they'd found in their barn. The closing bakery across town sent over a set of mismatched chairs, each one with character and history worn into its wood. Even the high school art teacher left a stack of hand-painted signs her students had made, decorated with twining vines and blooming flowers. Lila tried to resist at first. She stacked the donations in the corner of her shop, telling herself she'd return them once people understood the cafe wasn't happening. But the gifts kept coming, each one accompanied by a story, a memory, or a hope for what the space could become. One evening, after closing up shop, Lila found a small wooden box on her doorstep. It was beautifully carved with intricate flower patterns, the wood smooth with age. Inside, dried flower petals filled the box with their fading fragrance. Rose for love, lavender for devotion, chamomile for patience. Beneath the petals lay a note in Mrs. Evers's elegant handwriting. Your mother believed dreams grow from love. Looks like love's already planted. Lila sat on her shop steps, holding the box of petals as twilight settled over the street. She thought about her mother, about all the hours they'd spent dreaming up Clara's garden together. The sketches weren't just blueprints. They were love letters to the community, plans for a place where people could gather and grow together. The cafe hadn't been just Evan's gesture. It had been growing here all along. In every conversation over flower arrangements, every shared cup of tea, every small kindness passed between neighbors. The next morning, Lila called the construction crew back, but this time she didn't let them work alone. The town showed up with paintbrushes, sandpaper, and willing hands. Mr. Collins, retired for 20 years, spent hours carefully sanding down donated tables until they gleamed. The garden club planted flowers along the walkway, sharing stories about Clara as they worked. Children perched on stepladders, painting whimsical designs on the walls under their parents' watchful eyes. The high school woodshop class built window boxes for herbs. Even Mrs. Evers supervised from a comfortable chair, directing traffic and sharing cookies with the workers. Leela moved through it all in a kind of wonder, watching her mother's dream take shape through the hands of people who had loved her. The greenhouse windows sparkled in the spring sunshine, and the antique lights cast warm pools of gold across the growing space. Finally, on a clear morning, Lila stood before the front window with a brush in her hand. The paint was the exact shade of green her mother had always loved, like new leaves in spring. With steady strokes, she painted the name they'd chosen together years ago, Clara's Garden. Stepping back, she watched the paint dry in the morning light. The name seemed to glow against the fresh white walls, a testament to dreams that refuse to die and love that keeps growing. Lila went inside and took a fresh snow crocus from one of her shop's arrangements. She pressed it carefully between two pieces of glass, just as she had done so many times during those snowed-in days. The delicate purple-white petals seemed to hold all the promise of early spring, of hope pushing through frozen ground toward sunlight. She placed the pressed flower on the cafe's main windowsill, where morning light streamed through it like a promise. The glass caught the sun, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the wooden floor, nature's own celebration of new beginnings. Days later, the opening day dawned with a gentle warmth that filled Clara's garden with honey-colored light. Lila stood in the center of the cafe, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeams streaming through the greenhouse windows. Her hands moved with practiced grace as she adjusted the last of the centerpieces on each table. Each arrangement told its own story. On a round table near the window, yellow daffodils and bright gerbera daisies burst from a vintage copper vase. Joy, pure and simple. By the reading nook, white roses mingled with forget-me-nots and sprigs of rosemary in a delicate porcelain bowl. Memory, sweet and lasting. Near the counter, a striking combination of purple iris and white lilies reached skyward from an antique silver vessel. Second chances, bold and hopeful. Lila's hands trembled slightly as she straightened her apron, pressed and pristine for the occasion. The morning air held that special kind of quiet that comes before important moments, like the pause before an orchestra begins to play. The bell above the door chimed its first greeting at exactly 8 o'clock. Mrs. Evers stepped in, carrying a covered basket that filled the air with the scent of fresh-baked scones. "Couldn't let you open without proper pastries," she announced, making her way to the counter with determined steps. More townspeople followed, each bringing their own contributions to the day. Sarah from the hardware store arrived with her grandmother's promised china set, now polished to a perfect shine. The Henderson brothers carried in a tray of honey butter made from their own hives. Even little Maggie came bouncing in with her mother, clutching a carefully decorated card that read, "Welcome to Clara's Garden," in rainbow letters. The cafe filled steadily with warm bodies and warmer conversations. Sunlight caught the pressed flowers hanging in the windows, casting colorful shadows across wooden tables that Mr. Collins had lovingly restored. The garden visible through the back doors was still more potential than reality, just turned earth and a few early plantings. But visitors stood at the windows anyway, sharing ideas about what might grow there. Lila moved through it all in a kind of daze, greeting familiar faces and accepting hugs and well wishes. Her mother's presence seemed to fill every corner, in the hand-sewn cushions on the window seats, in the way the morning light caught the copper kettles, in the very spirit of the place that had grown from her dreams. As the morning crowd settled into a gentle rhythm, Lila prepared her first batch of signature tea. She'd named it Snow Bloom, inspired by those quiet days when winter first began to yield to spring. Into each carefully measured portion went dried lavender buds, fresh mint leaves, and delicate violet petals, a blend that spoke of endings becoming beginnings. She warmed her mother's favorite teapot, a beautiful piece hand-painted with climbing roses. The familiar ritual steadied her hands, warming the pot, measuring the blend, watching the water temperature with careful eyes. The scent rose with the steam, filling the air with memories of early spring mornings in the shop with her mother. The afternoon light had begun to soften, taking on that golden quality that made everything look like a remembered dream. Lila was pouring a fresh cup of Snow Bloom when the bell above the door chimed again. Something in the sound made her look up. Her hands stilled. The teapot hovered above the cup, frozen in mid-pour. Evan stood in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun. He looked different than she remembered, more present somehow, less like someone trying to disappear. In his hands, he held a bouquet that made her heart catch in her throat. The arrangement was exactly like the one she'd made that snowy night. Winter roses with their deep red petals, pure white snowdrops bobbing on delicate stems, and sprigs of evergreen that smelled of forest and survival. It was the kind of detail only someone who had truly seen her work would remember. The cafe's gentle murmur faded to silence as Evan stepped inside. His footsteps were quiet on the wooden floor as he approached the counter. With careful movements, he set the bouquet down between them. The flowers seemed to glow in the afternoon light, each petal perfect and intentional. "I didn't come to take anything," he said softly, his voice carrying in the hushed space. His eyes met hers, steady and clear. "I came to see the place where I remembered how to feel again." The words hung in the air between them, as delicate as the steam rising from the teacup in Lila's hands. Around them, the cafe held its breath. Mrs. Evers pretended to be very interested in her scone. Little Maggie watched with wide eyes from behind her mother's skirt. Lila set down the teapot with steady hands. She picked up the cup of snow bloom she'd just poured, the blend she'd created from memories of snow and survival and the first hints of spring. With deliberate steps, she walked around the counter. The tea rippled gently in the cup as she held it out to him. Their fingers brushed as he accepted it, warm skin against porcelain. This time, neither of them pulled away. Neither of them looked down. They stood in the afternoon light, surrounded by flowers and the quiet witnesses of their town, finally seeing each other clearly. The last customer waved goodbye as Lila turned the open sign to closed on Clara's garden's first day. The cafe still hummed with warmth, teacups waiting to be washed, and flowers releasing their evening fragrance into the quiet space. Through the greenhouse windows, she could see the sky darkening to a deep violet blue. Evan stood by the counter, carefully wrapping leftover scones in brown paper. He moved with the same quiet efficiency she remembered from those snowed-in days, when he'd fixed her drawer and tended to her flickering lights. Now, watching him fold precise corners in the paper, she noticed how much more at ease he seemed in his own skin. "Would you like to see the garden?" Lila asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "It's not much yet, but—" He nodded, setting down the wrapped scones. "I'd love to." They made their way through the back door onto the wooden steps that led down to the garden space. The evening air carried a familiar chill, and as they settled onto the top step, the first snowflakes began to drift down from the darkening sky. Lila caught her breath at the sight. The gentle fall of white against the purple dusk was so similar to that night weeks ago, when she'd found him half buried in snow, when everything had changed. Evan must have felt it too. He watched the snowflakes with a mix of wonder and something deeper, more painful. His shoulders carried a tension that hadn't been there moments before. "I owe you the truth," he said quietly, his eyes still on the falling snow. "All of it." Lila pulled her cardigan closer around her shoulders, settling in to listen. The snow fell silently around them, each flake catching what remained of the day's light. "I built my company from nothing," Evan began, his voice low but steady. "Wrote the first code in my garage, believed in making something that would help people connect. But somewhere along the way, it became about profit over privacy, data mining, selling information." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of old frustration. "When I found out how deep it went, how many lives were being exploited, I couldn't stay silent." The snow fell more heavily now, beginning to dust the freshly turned earth of the garden. "The board tried to bury it, offered me millions to keep quiet. When I refused, they tried to discredit me, called me unstable, paranoid." His laugh held no humor. "Maybe I was by the end. The media circus, the death threats, old friends suddenly becoming strangers. I broke. Completely broke." Lila watched his profile in the gathering darkness, seeing now the weight he'd carried even in those quiet days by her fire. "I drove north with no destination, just needed to disappear. Then the storm hit, and He gestured vaguely at the falling snow. "Well, you know the rest." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft patter of snowflakes on wooden steps. "You could have trusted me," Lila said finally, her voice gentle but firm. Evan turned to look at her, his eyes carrying a depth of regret she hadn't seen before. "I know," he replied, "but I didn't even trust myself back then." He reached into his coat, pulling out something wrapped in soft cloth. With careful movements, he unwrapped it, revealing a familiar napkin, crumpled and worn at the edges, but still clearly showing her sketch of the cafe. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She remembered drawing it that night, both of them warm by the fire, her fingers tracing dreams in blue ink. "I carried this with me," Evan said softly, holding the napkin like something precious. "Not because of the cafe, but because it reminded me that even broken things can bloom." The snow fell steadily now, transforming the garden into a blank canvas of white. Lila stood holding out her hand to him. "Come with me." She led him down the steps and through the snow-dusted garden to the back corner, where fresh soil waited, dark against the growing whiteness. Kneeling, she brushed away the gathering snow and pressed her fingers into the earth, creating a small hollow. From her apron pocket, she pulled out a single snowdrop bulb, the same flower that had watched over him that first night, that he'd preserved in glass, that had started everything. With gentle movements, she planted it in the waiting earth. "A new beginning," she said, smoothing soil over the bulb. Evan knelt beside her in the snow. His hand found hers, warm despite the cold air. Their fingers intertwined, earth still clinging to her skin. "I'm not here to disappear again," he said, his voice carrying a certainty she'd never heard before. "This time, if you'll have me, I'd like to stay." Snowflakes caught in their hair and on their shoulders as they knelt there in the growing dark. The garden around them waited, full of possibility, ready for spring. And in that moment, with snow falling just like the night they met, Clara's garden became more than just a dream. It became a place where love, at last, took root. If you enjoyed the story of Evan and Lila, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. If you enjoyed the story of Evan and Lila, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.